Yes, hello again and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we continue with part 2 of our walk around the racing paddock at the 2-day charity Scramble event that was held by the Northern Ireland Classic Scramble Club at Ballysallagh Road near Bangor. Now, the first machines that we're going to take a look at here is Eddie Long's 440 and 250 Myco twin shockers. Now, I think this first bike is Eddie's 440, or it could possibly even be a 400 Myco, and I'm sure that this is one of the old 1978 Magnums, which in their day were very good race bikes and almost as good as the 81 490, as they had quite a similar frame geometry to that iconic Mega 2. Now, this particular machine of Eddie's certainly looks in decent original condition, apart from maybe, of course, those black wheels, that replacement exhaust tailpipe, and maybe even those different handlebars and controls. But nonetheless, a good old twin shock racer, and Eddie will be riding this particular bike in the twin shock grade C class over the course of the 2 days. But these Myco power plants were pretty awesome motors, and I had an almost identical engine to this in my old 1980 440 when I raced it about 100 years ago, although the older 1980 chassis, as you know, wasn't Myco's best frame design, but thankfully they certainly made up for that particular error when they designed the 81 Mega 2 just a year later. But this 440 or even 400 bike of Eddie's, despite the different changes on it, is still a cracking looking bike. Now, next up, this is Eddie's other Myco racer, and this time it's a 1981 250 with the reed valve 2-stroke motor, which is another engine that I'm quite familiar with, because I also had an 81 250 as well when I was a twin shock racer. But again, these 250s were an excellent race bike, and they had an almost identical chassis to the 81 490, but of course naturally these were fitted with the smaller 250 motor. But this package of that Myco frame and that perky 2-stroke engine certainly made these an almost perfect club rider's bike, because if you were a little intimidated by the brute power of the bigger 490, then these 250s were a much better option, and if the tracks were tight and twisty, you could still achieve very good results if you were prepared to work this smaller engine. But if you were prepared to take the time and get one of these 2-stroke motors set up just right, it's quite surprising how quick these little engines really were. And if you were prepared to hustle the bike around the racetrack, they are certainly still capable of putting you somewhere on that podium in the top 3 finishers. But for me personally, I still think that these 81 250s are just about the perfect bike for twin shock racing, because they handle great, the engines are excellent, and of course spares are not really a problem when it comes to the bike's maintenance. But mind you, if you're a balls to the wall kind of guy and you like your twin shockers to scare you shitless, then the bigger 490 is definitely the bike for you. But having said that, these are still a very nice pair of old Myco racers. Now, as we continue with our German Myco theme, these are Reese Gazzard's race bikes, and it looks like we have a 1980 440 on the right there, and what looks like an 81 Mega 2 490 on the left. So Reese has a couple of options about which bike to use, and that 1980 440 is almost an identical machine to my old race bike from back in the day. But with these 490s, you just can't go wrong if it's power that you need, as these things have horsepower in absolute bucket loads, and it's just a case of twisting that throttle and then hanging on, and the bike will usually do the rest. But again, another nice pair of examples of when Michael ruled the world of motocross in the early 1980s. Okay, next up we're going to take a quick look around David Hamill's YZ250 Yamaha. Now, I'm not entirely sure of the actual year of David's bike, but it certainly looks like it could maybe be a 1980 or even a 1981 model. But once again, it's a very nice example of one of these iconic Yamaha motocrossers. Now, these monoshock Yamahas, of course, are fully eligible to race in the twin shock class by virtue of the fact that they have non-linkage rear suspension systems and an air-cooled two-stroke motor, and of course, most importantly, drum brakes on the front and rear of the bike. So you can look out for David racing this particular machine in the twin shock grade C class when I post the racing footage from this 2-day event, which will of course be my next video here on my channel. Now, as you're no doubt aware, these were still pretty awesome machines for the early 1980s, and they had quite good front and rear suspension and a sharp handling chassis, and that 250 two-stroke reed valve motor was certainly one of the best engines that you could get on a motocrosser from that period. Now, once again, these YZs had Yamaha's patented monocross alloy swing arm and suspension system, and again this system was a surefire upgrade from the older twin shock racers of the 1970s. But you can still see quite a few of these older YZs still taking part in classic and vintage racing, and even to this day these bikes are still very popular choices for vintage race machines. Okay, next up it's the time for an old British classic, and these are a couple of very nice vintage Greaves scramblers belonging to local man Craig McCoo. Now, first up, this is Craig's old 1965 Greaves Challenger, which I think is a 250 model, and Craig has quite a collection of these old Greaves bikes in his workshop, and it's great that he's still using them for racing and not just keeping them under wraps as old museum pieces. And talking of which, that's Craig's old Land Rover 101 in the background there, which he uses to pull his bike trailer to these classic race events. Now, this is Craig's other Greaves machine, and this time it's a Greaves Griffin, which is the model that replaced the Challenger that you just saw in the previous clip with that banana style cantilever front suspension. Now, when you ordered one of these later Griffins back in the late 1960s or early 1970s, you could still have them with the older style cantilever suspension on the front rather than the more conventional telescopic Seriani front forks. But back in the day, these Griffin fuel tanks would have been made in fiberglass, and you could of course have the tank and side panels in a variety of different colours, including this metal flake blue colour that Craig has on his bike. Now, as you can see, these Greaves motors had quite a large cylinder barrel surface area, and they say that this was to help dissipate the heat, because many of these Greaves bikes were sent to the USA to be used as desert racers. But again, as British-made scramblers go, these were quite good bikes, although in the early 1970s the big four Japanese companies were exporting cheaper and some would say even better machines into Europe and the USA, and smaller British manufacturers like Greaves just couldn't compete with the sheer volume of machines being sold around the world. But I'm sure you'll agree, and it goes without saying, that Craig certainly loves his old Greaves scramblers, and as I said, this is just a couple of the many examples that Craig has sitting around in his workshop. But Craig's old Land Rover 101 here is a bit of nostalgia in its own right, because this vehicle was used by the British Army to haul a field gun over rough terrain. It could also carry about a ton of equipment and ammunition in the rear as well. Now, their official title was a Land Rover 101 forward control, because the 101 was the amount of inches of the vehicle's wheelbase, and the forward control title was because the driver sat above and slightly in front of the front wheels. But they were as tough as old boots, and you couldn't buy any of them off the production line, but you certainly could purchase one through Army surplus vehicle sales. Okay, anyhow, back to old dirt bikes once again, and this lovely YZ250 Yamaha is Norman Scott's superb race bike. Now, once again, I'm not entirely sure of the year of this bike, because I never actually spoke to Norman on the day, but I'm 99% sure that this is a 1983 example. Now again, what can you say about these 83 250s that's not already been said? But it's pretty fair to comment that these YZs were certainly one of the machines you just had to have if you were a top rider back in 1983. Now, this water-cooled 8-petal reed valve motor was a little rocket ship of an engine that had a 68mm bore and stroke, and it also had Yamaha's YPVS power valve, or Yamaha Power Valve System, if you want to give it its full title. But coupled with a 5-speed gearbox, this was a pretty potent package for a 250 motocrosser. Now, that Keehan flat slide carburetor was not a standard fitting in 1983, as I think it was a 38mm Mikuni that fed this motor with its fuel in that particular year. But Norman's example here is not a fully blown original bike from 83, but nonetheless it's just great to see one of these bikes again in the flesh and still taking part in vintage racing. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, I think these front forks were originally 43mm Kayabas, which didn't have much scope for adjustment for damping, but as I remember, I think they had a pop-off valve for adjusting the compression, and I think it was a Kayaba single monoshock fitted at the rear, and both the front and rear suspensions on these bikes was still pretty good in standard trim, and you could improve the front end of the bike by experimenting with different weights of oil, or maybe adding or removing low pressure air from the forks. But once again, another iconic bike from the early 1980s, and it's a credit to Norman for keeping the bike in such good condition, and of course for continuing to use it as a classic racer. Okay, next up it's the turn of Dean McBride's very nice looking XR200 Honda. Now, normally these little XR200s are not really associated with being a serious all-out motocross bike, as many owners just tended to use them as fun bikes for a little trek through the woods or maybe up on the hills. But I must say, I was quite impressed with the way that Dean has prepared this bike, because it certainly looks like a proper purpose-built scrambler. Now, these XR200 4-stroke motors are another of Honda's iconic engines that just seem to be completely unbreakable, because these little motors can take all manner of abuse. But then again, that's maybe one of the reasons why Dean has chosen this particular power plant for his race bike. But of course, just like many of Honda's other small 4-stroke motors, these single-cylinder 2-valve engines were ultra reliable and they virtually never ever gave you any trouble as long as they were looked after and well maintained. But fun bike or not, Dean has certainly made a good job of putting this little XR200 to good use as a vintage racer, and I bet that little 200cc motor sounds good through this big bore aluminium tailpipe. Now, I'm sure that I heard Dean say on the day that he had fitted a set of Suzuki front end forks onto this little Honda, because I expect that the original XR200 forks would have been far too soft for motocross use. But it's a fine looking little motorcycle, and maybe Dean might be out horsepowered by some of the bigger bikes when he takes to the track in the twin shock grade C class, but I'll bet you that he'll still have a lot of fun on his XR200 nevertheless. But as I said, this is not a bike that's normally used in motocross events, but if it's reliability that you're looking for and the fun factor, then these little XR200s certainly make an excellent choice. But that's of course if you can actually find one, because many owners of these little Hondas tend to like them so much they keep a hold of them, and it can be extremely hard to find a very good example. Okay, next up, time for a quick look at Tad Haney's pair of old KX Kawasaki's. Now, it looks like we've got a KX 420 here and maybe a 250 from the early 1980s. Now, these big 420s weren't, of course, Kawasaki's greatest bike, and I think this might be a 1982 example shown here. And as I recall, one of the major flaws with these 420s were that they appeared to have very brittle frames, as riders were forever repairing cracks and chassis breakages. And again, these 420 two-stroke motors were probably adequate at best, and it's quite well documented that these reed valve engines certainly lacked a bit of horsepower, and that's more than likely why you very seldom see these 420s at vintage race events nowadays. But of course, our particular owner of both these bikes seems to have other views on these KXs, and he's brought along this nice pair of examples to race in the grade C class of the twin shocks. But nonetheless, a nice pair of KXs that you very seldom see racing these days, and nice to see a couple of these quite rare and iconic machines once again. Now, it looks like Andrew Nicol here is having a bit of a mechanical issue with his old Cotton EMX, which again is another quite rare machine, but that's the thing about old vintage race bikes. There's always something that's needing sorted. Now, next up, we're going to take a brief look at Willie Burgess's 490 Micro. Now, Willie is still regarded as one of the top twin shock racers in his native Northern Ireland, and he also does a lot of his racing on the UK mainland, where he races in the Tough Sheet National Twin Shock Championship, where I think he's currently leading the over 50s championship with 300 points, just ahead of Jim Shand on 268. Now, I have to say I was quite looking forward to watching Willie in action at this event in the Twin Shock Grade A class, although I think Willie only actually got about a lap of practice before the gearbox on this 490 packed in, so we never actually got to see Willie perform on this very quick 490, which was a bit of a shame really, because it's usually a good spectacle to see him take to the track. Now, this last and final bike from the Racing Paddock at this 2-day charity event in Northern Ireland is William Stevenson's old 1978 YZ 400 Yamaha. Now, William told me that he's owned and raced this bike since he bought it brand new back in 1978, and how many old motocross owners can say that these days, that they've been racing the very same bike for the last 43 years. And although William's bike's not going to win any next shiny bike or concourse competition anytime soon, this is still a genuine, no-nonsense vintage racer. And I must say, William must love his old YZ to bits, because it's quite rare that riders hold on to a particular race bike for more than a year or so at a time, as they tend to sell them to upgrade to the latest bike for the next racing season. And although this old bike's not much to look at, it's very seldom that you see a one-owner motocross race bike that's still being ridden by its original buyer 43 years down the line. And if you take a look at the future racing videos from this event coming soon to my channel, you may catch a glimpse of William racing this YZ Yamaha in the Grade C twin shock class. So all I can say is well done to you, William, for keeping going, and of course for sticking with a particular race machine for all these years, because as genuine motocross racers go, your old YZ 400 is a perfect example. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that little walk around the paddock and having a look at some of those very nice Irish machines that are soon to race at this two-day event here at Ballysallagh Road. So don't forget, you can see all of these bikes in action on the racetrack in future videos here on my YouTube channel. So if you've not already subscribed to my channel, then I hope you will consider doing that very thing, in order that you don't miss out on all the racing action from this two-day event here at Ballysallagh Road. Okay, until the next time, everybody, continue to keep safe and well, and we'll all speak again when we return to talk about more vintage iron right here on your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.